A cartoon has no business seeing the future. It has no data, no lab, no crystal ball, just comedy writers on a deadline. Then a flu joke from 1993 lined up with a real outbreak decades later, and a background sign became a real $52 billion deal. Something in these old scripts keeps matching reality. A cartoon flu that would not stay in the past. The episode is called Margin Chains. It aired on May 6, 1993, as the 21st episode of the show's 4th season. Written by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, the story follows Marge getting arrested for accidentally shoplifting a bottle of bourbon after an exhausting week caring for a sick household. That sickness starts with a joke. A juicer called the Juice Loosener ships from Osaka, Japan, packed by a worker who has the flu, and every box that leaves the factory carries his germs along with it. Weeks later, Springfield gets hit with what the show calls the Osaka flu, shown on screen as green clouds of cartoon sickness drifting through the streets. Bill Oakley later explained the joke came from something real he remembered from childhood, the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968, a genuine global outbreak caused by an influenza A strain called H3N2 that killed roughly 33,800 people in the United States alone. He was not forecasting anything. He was reaching back into history for a plot device that explained why one tired mother finally snapped in a checkout line. Oakley has since described the germ cloud effect in the episode as intentionally over the top, a cartoonish exaggeration of how a virus might spread, rather than any kind of medical accuracy. Decades later, a new flu variant called subclade K, part of that exact same H3N2 family, spread through the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United States during the 2025 and 2026 flu season, catching that year's vaccine formula off guard, because it had already been finalized before scientists identified the new strain. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention labeled the season moderate from its very first weekly report in January 2026, and never changed that label, even as the confirmed pediatric death count climbed from 9 to 17 to 149, to a final total of 174 by late May. Health officials studying the strain itself, including Nicola Lewis of the World Influenza Center at the Francis Crick Institute, said there was no evidence of unusual or concerning viral evolution behind it. It was ordinary flu doing what ordinary flu has always done. That gap between a mild-sounding label and a genuinely rough season is the real story sitting behind the meme. But the flu joke is far from the only cartoon moment people have dug back up looking for hidden meaning, and one from 4 years later leans on a virus with a much darker real-world history. The book Bart was never supposed to see. On October 19, 1997, an episode called Lisa's Sax aired, mostly built around flashbacks explaining how Lisa got her saxophone as a child. Buried inside one flashback scene is a much smaller moment. Marge tries to coax a sick young Bart out of bed and offers him a children's book to read, pulling out one titled Curious George and the Ebola Virus. When she asks if he would rather color something instead, Bart holds up a drawing of himself lying dead, surrounded by bodies and blood, playing the whole exchange as a dark, quick joke, rather than any kind of statement about a real disease. 17 years later, in 2014, the largest Ebola outbreak in recorded history tore through West Africa, killing thousands of people and drawing international attention as health workers scrambled to contain it. Fans dug up the old joke almost immediately once headlines about the outbreak spread, framing a single sight gag about a fake children's book as proof the show had somehow known. There is no evidence anyone writing that 1997 episode was thinking about a future outbreak on another continent. Ebola itself was already a known virus at the time, first identified back in 1976, with smaller outbreaks recorded periodically in Central Africa throughout the decades before 2014. Referencing Ebola in a joke in 1997 required no special insight, since the virus already had a real name, a real history, and had already appeared in genuine news coverage more than once before that episode ever aired. What changed in 2014 was the scale of the outbreak, not the existence of the disease itself. The joke and the real crisis shared a name and nothing else, which is exactly the kind of coincidence that becomes obvious in hindsight and invisible beforehand. Naming a real, already documented virus in a punchline is a very different thing from guessing which virus would eventually cause the largest outbreak in history. The writers picked a name that already sounded frightening to audiences in 1997 for a 2-second joke about a morbid child's drawing, and the internet did the rest of the work 17 years later, connecting two moments that had nothing to do with each other beyond sharing 5 letters. That same pattern, an old joke resurfacing the moment a real event with a similar shape hits the news, plays out again with a story involving big cats, bright lights, and one of the most famous entertainers in Las Vegas history. The Tiger That Waited 10 Years. In 1993, an episode titled Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling, introduced 2 recurring characters named Gunter and Ernst, a pair of flamboyant Las Vegas magicians clearly modeled on the real-life duo Siegfried and Roy. During a performance at Mr. Burns' new casino, their white tiger turns on them mid-show and attacks, ending their act in chaos. On October 3rd, 2003, almost exactly 10 years after that episode aired, Roy Horn was attacked on stage at the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas by a white tiger named Montecore during a live performance. The tiger bit Horn on the neck and dragged him off stage in front of a live audience. Horn survived the attack but suffered severe injuries, including partial paralysis, and the incident permanently ended Siegfried and Roy's decades-long Las Vegas show. The show's own production team addressed the comparison directly at the time, pointing out that an accident involving exotic animal trainers was, in their own words, bound to happen sooner or later, given how many years performers like Siegfried and Roy had spent working directly with large predatory cats in front of live crowds. Animal trainers working with tigers face a real, well-documented occupational risk, and outside observers had raised concerns about the safety of exotic animal acts in Las Vegas long before 2003. Siegfried and Roy themselves had performed with big cats for decades by that point, and earlier incidents involving trainers and their animals had already made headlines elsewhere in the entertainment industry throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Writing a joke about a fictional tiger act ending in disaster was less a leap into the unknown and more a BET on a risk that was already sitting in plain sight for anyone paying attention to Las Vegas entertainment news. That kind of educated guess, dressed up as a joke and later mistaken for prophecy, shows up again in one of the show's most famous supposed predictions, this time aimed squarely at the business world rather than the entertainment industry. The Sign on the Studio Lot. The episode is called When You Dish Upon a Star. It aired on November 8th, 1998, as the 5th episode of the show's 10th season, written by Richard Appel. The story follows Homer becoming a personal assistant to fictionalized versions of Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, eventually pitching a script to real-life director Ron Howard and producer Brian Grazer. During one brief scene set outside a studio lot, a sign in the background reads, 20th Century Fox, a division of Walt Disney Company, a quick visual gag tucked into the corner of the frame. On December 14th, 2017, the Walt Disney Company announced a deal to acquire the bulk of 21st Century Fox, including the studio behind that exact sign, for $52.4 billion. Almost immediately, the 19-year-old screenshot resurfaced across social media, presented as proof. The show had somehow known nearly 2 decades ahead of time. Show writer Al Jean pushed back on that framing directly, telling reporters at the time that people would make far too much of what he called a mere coincidence. Then executive producer Mike Scully later explained the actual origin of the joke in an interview, saying it was simply one of those moments where the writers needed a background sign gag for an exterior shot, and Disney's growing media dominance was already an obvious punchline to reach for in 1998. Rich Appel, who wrote the episode, admitted years later that he did not fully remember how the specific gag came together, beyond a general sense already floating around the writer's room that Disney would eventually own everything in Hollywood. Disney had already spent years buying up major entertainment properties by that point, and predicting more consolidation in an industry that was consolidating constantly required nothing more than paying attention to the news already happening around the writer's room. By the time the real deal closed, Disney's holdings already included Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm, home of the Star Wars franchise, a buying pattern that had been building in plain sight for close to 2 decades before Fox ever entered the conversation. That explanation, an educated guess about an obvious industry trend dressed up as a background joke, sets up the most famous and most politically loaded example of this whole pattern, one involving an actual future president of the United States. The president nobody wanted to believe in. On March 19th, 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future aired as part of the show's 11th season, written by Dan Greaney. The plot shows Bart getting a glimpse of his own adult life 30 years ahead, where he has become a broke, directionless musician, while his younger sister Lisa has become the first female president of the United States. In one scene, Lisa tells her cabinet that her administration has inherited quite a budget crunch from President Trump, and her staff confirms the country is completely broke, blaming a string of failed spending programs left behind by her predecessor, including a fictional childhood investment plan and a fictional midnight basketball program that supposedly backfired badly. Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in November 2016, 16 years after that episode first aired, and again in November 2024. Both times, the old clip of Lisa's line resurfaced across social media within hours, framed once again as proof. The show had predicted the outcome of a real presidential election over a decade and a half in advance. Dan Greaney addressed the comparison directly in an interview years later, describing the joke as a warning rather than a prediction. He explained that the writers needed Lisa to inherit a country in the worst possible condition imaginable, and using a wealthy, brash television personality already known for talk of running for office felt like the logical low point for a fictional America to hit before recovering under a new president. Trump had already flirted publicly with running for president multiple times before 2000, including a real, if brief, campaign under the Reform Party banner that same year, so writing him into a joke about political chaos required imagination rather than foresight. The specific detail that turned out true, that a real Trump administration would in fact leave behind serious federal budget concerns, according to various later analyses, was a reasonably safe bet about any wealthy businessman turned politician, not a specific policy forecast. Some observers have also pointed out visual similarities between animated President Lisa's inauguration outfit, a purple suit with a pearl necklace, and the outfit Kamala Harris wore at her own vice presidential inauguration in January 2021, adding yet another layer to the ongoing internet fascination with this particular episode. That kind of visual echo, much like the budget crunch line itself, says more about how common certain colors and styles are in American political fashion than about any specific act of foresight from a group of comedy writers in 1999. None of these individual stories, taken alone, look particularly mysterious once someone tracks down where the joke actually came from and what the writers actually knew when they wrote it. But 5 or 6 of them stacked together, spread across genuinely different decades, is exactly the kind of pattern that makes people start looking for something bigger going on. And 2 more examples, one from the world of sports and one from the world of theoretical physics, push that feeling even further. The referee who called the whole tournament. On March 30th, 2014, an episode titled "You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee" aired as part of the show's 25th season. The plot sends Homer to Brazil to work as a referee at that year's World Cup, where he is approached by an executive from a fictional stand-in for FIFA, soccer's real-world governing body, who tells Homer that corruption runs through the entire organization and that they need an honest man to help clean things up. Partway through the episode, that same executive who came to recruit Homer gets arrested on screen for corruption of his own. The episode also shows Brazil losing badly to Germany late in the tournament, with Germany going on to win the whole competition. The episode aired 3 months before that year's Real World Cup kicked off in Brazil that June. During the actual semifinal, Germany defeated Brazil by an enormous margin, 7-1, one of the most lopsided results in World Cup history. And Germany went on to win the tournament exactly as the cartoon had shown. Then, roughly a year later, in May 2015, the United States Department of Justice unsealed a major indictment against multiple senior FIFA officials on charges including racketeering, fraud, and money laundering, kicking off a real corruption scandal that dominated international sports headlines for months, and eventually led to the resignation of the organization's longtime president. None of this required supernatural insight either. FIFA had already faced persistent, widely reported allegations of bribery and corruption for years before 2014. particularly surrounding how the organization selected host countries for future tournaments. So writing a joke about institutional corruption inside FIFA was closer to describing an open secret than predicting a surprise. Germany, meanwhile, entered the 2014 tournament as one of the most talented and well-regarded national teams in the world, making a strong run to the title a reasonably safe guess for anyone with a basic understanding of international soccer at the time, rather than a genuine long-shot forecast. The joke about the corrupt official getting arrested landed so well specifically because corruption inside FIFA was already such a familiar storyline that almost any exaggerated version of it was likely to feel true. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. That instinct, reaching for an exaggerated version of a trend that insiders already understood, shows up again in the strangest and most technical example of this entire pattern, one that involves an actual mathematical equation scrawled across a cartoon chalkboard. The equation on a cartoon chalkboard. On September 20th, 1998, an episode called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace aired, written by John Swartzwelder from an idea pitched by Dan Greeny. The story follows Homer realizing his life is half over and deciding to reinvent himself as an inventor in the mold of Thomas Edison, coming up with gadgets like a makeup gun and an electric hammer. During one scene, Homer is shown standing in front of a blackboard, covered in a dense, genuinely complex-looking mathematical equation. In 2013, physicist and author Simon Singh published a book called The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets, examining the surprising amount of real mathematics hidden throughout the show's history. Singh pointed out that the equation on Homer's blackboard, when solved, produces a predicted mass for a theoretical particle called the Higgs boson of roughly 775 giga-electron volts. The real Higgs boson, confirmed by physicists at CERN's Large Hadron Collider in 2012, 14 years after that episode aired, turned out to have a mass closer to 125 giga-electron volts. Singh described Homer's guess as reasonably close in the grand scheme of particle physics, even though it was off by a significant margin in absolute terms. The explanation behind the joke has nothing to do with Homer or the show's writers guessing the future of physics. Episode writer David Cohen, who has a background in physics and computer science, built the equation together with his real-life friend David Shiminovich, an astronomer at Columbia University, deliberately combining recognizable constants like the Planck constant, the gravitational constant, and the speed of light into something that looked authentic and plausible, using the best physics knowledge available in 1998. Cohen was one of several Simpsons writers over the years who held real science and mathematics degrees from top universities before joining the show, a detail Singh highlighted repeatedly in his research, arguing that the show's writing staff has quietly included more working scientists and mathematicians than almost any other program in American television history. Building a physically plausible-looking equation using real constants and real physics knowledge, and having it land somewhat close to a value scientists would later measure using multi-billion-dollar equipment, is a mark of genuine technical skill among the writing staff, not a supernatural glimpse into a laboratory in Switzerland that would not exist for another 14 years. That explanation, real expertise dressed up as a cartoon joke, connects directly to the deeper question sitting underneath every one of these stories. One that has far less to do with fate and far more to do with who exactly has been writing the show for the past 4 decades. Why this keeps happening. The Simpsons has produced more than 790 episodes across nearly 4 decades on the air, covering nearly every corner of American life along the way, including sickness, politics, business, entertainment, sports, and technology. That sheer volume matters more than most viral posts ever mention. A show writing jokes about nearly every subject imaginable, for that many years, in a country where news events happen constantly, was always going to occasionally land close to something real, just by covering enough ground. This is a well-documented pattern in psychology called hindsight bias, where an event that already happened starts to look far more predictable in retrospect than it ever actually was beforehand. Nobody circulated screenshots of the thousands of Simpsons jokes that never lined up with anything real. Only the handful that eventually matched a headline get remembered, reposted, and treated as evidence of some kind of foresight, while everything else quietly gets forgotten. That selective memory is exactly why a show covering enough topics for enough years will always seem to have predicted more than it actually did. The writing staff itself adds another layer to the explanation that rarely makes it into viral posts. Beyond David Cohen's physics background, the show has employed writers with degrees from Harvard, many of whom came from the university's famous student humor magazine, along with staff who studied mathematics, computer science, and other technical fields before moving into comedy writing. A staff that technically literate, working on a show given enormous freedom to satirize institutions ranging from FIFA to Disney to the federal government, was always positioned to make sharper, more specific, better informed jokes about how real systems actually behave than a typical comedy writing room might produce. The writers behind these specific episodes have been remarkably consistent and open about this whenever reporters ask them directly. Bill Oakley pointed to a real 1968 pandemic sitting in his memory. Al Jean called the Disney comparison a mere coincidence. Dan Greeny described his Trump joke as a warning built from an obvious punchline rather than a specific forecast. David Cohen built his equation using real constants and real collaboration with a working astronomer. Every single one of these explanations points toward the same thing: writers paying close attention to real trends, real history, real institutions, and real risks already sitting in plain view, then exaggerating them into jokes, rather than any of them staring into some kind of crystal ball. Once you strip away the mystery and hindsight bias framing, what remains is not nothing. It is actually a far more interesting explanation than prophecy, one that says a lot more about how good satire actually works. What actually deserves the credit? Good satire has always worked by noticing patterns most people are not paying close enough attention to and pushing them slightly further than reality has gone yet. A joke about media companies buying each other up works because media companies really were buying each other up constantly throughout the 1990s. A joke about a flu spreading through imported goods works because flu pandemics really do spread along international trade and travel routes, the same way the real 1968 outbreak did. A joke about an exotic animal trainer getting hurt works because exotic animal acts really do carry that risk every single time they walk on stage. A joke about a corrupt sports official works because that same organization had already spent years fending off real corruption allegations. Even a joke built around a genuine physics equation works because the writer behind it actually understood the physics well enough to build something realistic in the first place. None of these jokes required looking decades into the future. They required looking closely at the present and asking a simple question that any sharp comedy writer already asks by habit. Given how things are trending right now, what is the next logical, slightly exaggerated step? Sometimes that exaggerated step turns out to happen for real years later, not because the joke caused it or foresaw it, but because the underlying trend the joke was built on kept moving in the same direction the whole time. That distinction matters more than it might seem, especially now that new supposed predictions from the show keep surfacing almost every year. From an old Elon Musk and Twitter joke, to a Silicon Valley episode fans have compared to real startup scandals, to a 2012 episode about robots replacing nuclear plant workers that resurfaced during recent debates over artificial intelligence and job losses. Treating every one of these moments as proof of secret foresight risks missing the much more grounded explanation sitting right underneath it, which is that a show with this much cultural reach, staffed for decades by genuinely sharp and often technically trained writers, has simply been paying close attention to American life for a very long time. Verdict: none of the moments covered here were ever genuine predictions in the way social media keeps framing them. The Osaka flu joke was built from a real 1968 pandemic, not a forecast of subclade K decades later. The Ebola joke referenced a virus that already existed and had already made real news before 1997. The tiger attack joke bet on a known occupational risk that trainers like Siegfried and Roy had lived with for their entire careers. The Disney joke extended an obvious media consolidation trend already unfolding in 1998. The Trump joke exaggerated a real businessman already known for flirting with a presidential run, using him as a symbol of national decline rather than a specific electoral forecast. The FIFA joke leaned on corruption allegations that were already an open secret in international soccer, paired with a reasonable sports guess about a strong German team. The Higgs-boson equation came from a writer with real physics training deliberately building something scientifically plausible using known constants, not a lucky guess pulled from thin air. What actually happened, in every single one of these cases, is that a show covering an enormous amount of American cultural ground, for close to 4 decades, staffed along the way by unusually well-educated writers, occasionally brushed up against something real simply through sheer volume, real expertise, and sharp attention to existing trends. The writers involved have said as much themselves, repeatedly, whenever anyone bothered to ask them directly instead of just screenshotting the coincidence. The real story was never a cartoon seeing the future. It was a group of comedy writers paying closer attention to the present and knowing considerably more about how the world actually works than most of their audience ever gave them credit for. If you're enjoying this one, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown.